Voting in the United States has always had its challenges. In various places and times in our history, elections have been challenged, corruption suspected, and in a few cases, fraud and illegality have been proven. The most recent challenge to electoral integrity was in the 2020 presidential election, which was mired in controversy, and some provable examples of voter fraud, interference, and malfeasance were established. See our video on that event. On January 6, 2021, the Capitol Hill event is often erroneously cited as a coup to overthrow the government by Democrats, who were largely responsible for not accepting proper security when offered. But it was not an armed revolt against established elected authority. But there was one event where it did turn deadly, and Americans took up arms against other Americans to ensure their election was fair and just. What was the Battle of Athens? Why did it occur? Who was involved? What was the outcome? Hello, I'm Colin Heaton, former history professor, Army and Marine Corps veteran, and welcome to this episode of Forgotten History. In 1936, in McMinn County, Tennessee, the political landscape took a drastic turn. It began with the election of Paul Cantrell, the Democratic candidate for sheriff. The Cantrell family was quite wealthy and had political influence locally and in Washington. His election was controversial, and many of the people in Athens believed the ballot boxes were swapped, but there was no evidence, just the locals talking with each other comparing who they voted for. During that time, the laws of Tennessee allowed for corruption, which was rampant. Cantrell deputized thugs who were his friends, and they made money on every arrest. They made more money if there was conviction and incarceration, essentially running a bogus law enforcement slave market. Deputies would board buses and stop cars and arrest people for various crimes, such as being drunk even when they were not, vagrancy, anything they could think of. Just the sheriff's signature on a voucher was all that was needed to get payment from the county courthouse. Cantrell's men also ran gambling and prostitution rackets frequented by their wealthy friends, who would lure unsuspecting strangers into these locations only for these strangers to be arrested for illegal activities. Cantrell was re-elected through manipulation and intimidation, serving 10 years as sheriff and becoming wealthier. In all the elections, ballot boxes were collected and the ballots counted in secret at the McMinn County Jail in Athens. Opposition poll watchers were labeled as troublemakers and ejected from precinct houses. The 1940 election saw George Woods from Etowah, a friend of Cantrell's, elected to the state legislature. Once there, Woods promptly introduced an act to redistrict McMinn County, reducing the number of voting precincts from 23 to 12, and reducing the number of justices of the peace from 14 to 7, with 4 working for Cantrell. After Governor Prentice Cooper signed Woods' bill into law on February 15, 1941, effective Republican opposition died in McMinn County. It was a one-party county, and Cantrell was now in the state Senate. However, Republicans still held the McMinn County Court, and they directed the county to purchase voting machines. Cantrell's Democrats countered by having Woods get a bill passed in Nashville, abolishing the court and selling the machines to save the county money. Department of Justice records show investigations of electoral fraud in McMinn County in 1940, 1942, and 1944, all without resolution. The corruption was no secret. Mansfield and local deputies had been using the county as a money-making machine the whole time. They arrested people for invented crimes to charge them with fees they then pocketed. Returning veterans were especially targeted since the deputies knew they had money. Bill White recalled coming home from overseas with mustering out pay in his pocket. He stated, "There were several beer joints and honky-tonks around Athens. We were pretty wild. We started having trouble with the law enforcement at that time because they started making a habit of picking up GIs and fining them heavily for most anything. They were kind of making a racket out of it. After long, hard years of service, most of us were hardcore veterans of World War II. We were used to drinking our liquor and our beer without being molested. When these things happened, the GIs got madder. The more GIs they arrested, the more they beat up, the madder we got." End quote. Under-the-table brothels and casinos paid the deputies to let them keep operating. Athens became known for vice and violence, and the returning veterans saw tyranny reigning without accountability. McKinn County veteran Bill White again stated, "You come back to a town that's run by a bunch of outlaws." He was referring to then State Senator Paul Cantrell and his cronies, and White was trying to rally his fellow vets and their supporters to take a stand against election fraud. Continuing with White, he said, "The veterans had formed an opposition group, running 5 candidates for local offices, but it looked like they were about to lose, whether or not it was the will of the people." End quote. The veterans fielded candidates for 5 offices, but interest centered on the race for sheriff between Henry Knox and the incumbent. Since the 1936 election, Cantrell had gone on to the state legislature and installed Pat Mansfield as the sheriff of McMinn County. Mansfield had done very nicely for himself during his term in office. His 4 years as sheriff had netted him an estimated $104,000. But now, in 1946, Cantrell was running for sheriff and Mansfield for state senator. They were just going to change jobs. By the time White made the speech late in the day of August 1st, 1946, Cantrell's supporters were widely stealing the election, spending the day intimidating voters and poll workers, even beating and shooting some of them, taking the ballot boxes off to the Athens jail when it was all over. Here is what happened. On the morning of August 1st, the Veterans Group issued a statement over the radio urging people to get out and vote without fear and to survey the counting of votes. They used their slogan throughout their campaign, "Your vote will be counted as cast." Pat Mansfield, who was running for Paul Cantrell's state Senate seat, expected conflict on Election Day and swore in 300 special deputies, many from out of town, some even out of state. This was done partially in response to veterans from nearby Blount County offering to come help McMinn vets monitor the polls. The veterans publicly offered a $1,000 reward for anyone bringing evidence of election fraud. Voters arrived on August 1st in the largest turnout in local history, who were confronted by 300 of Sheriff Mansfield's special deputies. Trouble began early. At 9:30 a.m., when Walter Ellis, a legally appointed GI representative at the 1st Precinct and the courthouse, was arrested and jailed for protesting irregularities. The veterans and their supporters posted poll watchers, and the sheriff's deputies threatened them throughout the day and only allowed a few people into the polling places at a time and watched them as they voted. Because they turned away some legitimate voters, someone sent an urgent message to the Department of Justice. There was no response from federal Democrats, just as there had been no answer to more than 1,000 messages about voting fraud sent from McMinn County to the department in the previous 10 years. They knew Cantrell had posted armed guards at each precinct. Inside L.L. Schaefer's jewelry store, Jim Buttram, who saw combat in Africa, Sicily, Italy, and Normandy, showed the 200 veterans who arrived copies of the 2 telegrams dated July 22nd that he sent to Governor Jim McCord in Nashville, Tennessee, the other to Attorney General Tom Clark in Washington, D.C. They requested assistance to ensure a fair election. Neither had been answered. They all knew that after 4 p.m. poll closing, the ballot boxes would be moved to the jail for counting. Tom Gillespie, a black farmer, tried to vote, and Wendy Wise, a Cantrell sheriff's deputy, told Gillespie, "N-word, you can't vote here." When Gillespie protested, Wise struck him with brass knuckles. Gillespie dropped his ballot and ran for the door. That was when Wise pulled his revolver and shot him in the back as he reached the sidewalk. During the confusion following the shooting, the 2 GI poll watchers, Ed Vestal and Charlie Scott had been seized and held hostage inside the waterworks by Wise and another Cantrell deputy, Carl Neal. When the veterans reached the waterworks, the crowd began taunting the armed guards. Later on, the New York Times would report that at the time, about 1,000 people stormed the jail and the surrounding area, where around 200 deputies were barricaded. This was the beginning of the Battle of Athens. But let's get what led up to that. As Wise and Neal stood at a window watching the angry throng outside, Vestal and Scott plunged through the plate glass windows and ran bleeding for the protection of the crowd. Wise stepped through the broken glass, waving his weapon, threatening the crowd. A polling place for the 12th precinct had been set up on the back of the Dixie Cafe, across Hornsby's Alley from the jail, and commanded by Minus Wilburn for Cantrell. Veterans Bob Harrell and Leslie Dooley were assigned as the GI poll watchers. They saw Wilburn letting minors vote and handing out cash to adult voters, essentially buying votes. At 3:45 p.m., Wilburn attempted to allow a young woman to vote despite the fact that she had no poll tax receipt and that her name did not appear on the registration list. Harrell's patience gave out. As Wilburn reached to deposit the ballot, Harrell grabbed his wrist. Wilburn slapped him across the head with a blackjack and kicked him in the face as he fell to the floor. Then he closed the precinct, ordered Hornsby Alley blocked at both ends, and, with a procession of guards, crossed the lawn to the jail with the ballot box and the GIs as captives. Only minutes later, at another location, poll watcher and veteran Bob Harrell protested when an ineligible voter was allowed to vote. A deputy on the scene beat him severely, and when another vet tried to intervene, he was threatened at gunpoint. Seeing what was going on, the veterans broke into the National Guard armory, stole weapons, ammunition, and walked to the jail, where they began a standoff with sheriff's deputies. Just how many people were involved is unclear, but the New York Times said 1,000. At the end of that voting day, 2 more veteran poll watchers were also threatened with weapons when they tried to exit a polling place. They were watching votes being counted but not allowed to really see anything, prompting them to leave. Fearing for his life, one of them smashed through a glass door and sought protection. Chief Deputy Bo Dunn and his men secured the area from the building to his car, and the ballot box was loaded. Wise told Dunn about the GI's threat. The chief deputy ordered 2 of his men to GI headquarters to arrest those whom Wise could identify. The rest of the deputies piled into the cruiser, which sped back toward the jail. When the 2 deputies reached the GI headquarters, they were disarmed and taken prisoner. So were 2 others later sent as reinforcements. A crowd began to gather outside. 3 more deputies came with pistols drawn, only to be pummeled and dragged inside. The crowd began to demand the lives of the captives. Some of the veterans agreed to killing them. This talk alarmed Otto Kennedy, and he left, vowing to have no part in murder. The crowd began to disperse, and most of the GIs left. Soon, a small group of veterans was alone with 7 hostages. The veterans took the hostages into the woods 10 miles out of town, beat them, and handcuffed them to trees. Later, the ballot boxes from all precincts were taken to the jail for further counting, at which point Bill White made his speech to discouraged veterans. By 6 p.m., it seemed to be over. GI headquarters was deserted, and unhappy crowds moved quietly along the streets. Another election had been stolen, and nothing could be done about it. At 8:30 p.m., a local radio station reported that the veterans and their supporters had surrounded the jail, and White issued a challenge to the deputies inside the building, yelling that unless someone brought the ballot boxes out, we are going to set siege against the jail and blow it down. When the deputies didn't agree, the veterans opened fire, which the deputies immediately returned. Some veterans were being held hostage inside, and the battle intensified when demands for their release were also denied. By 9 p.m., Paul Cantrell, Pat Mansfield, State Representative George Woods, who was also a member of the Election Commission, and about 50 deputies, were locked inside the jail and going through the ballot boxes. The following events are still unclear. White says he was the one to call it out, stating, "Would you damn bastards bring those damn ballot boxes out here, or we are going to set siege against the jail and blow it down," he said again. Moments later, The night exploded in automatic weapons fire punctuated by shotgun blasts. "I fired the first shot," White claimed. "Then everybody started shooting from our side." A deputy ran for the jail. White says, "I shot him. He wheeled and fell inside of the jail. I shot a second man. His leg flew out from under him, and he crawled under a car." Cantrell and his accomplices refused to surrender. As the uncertain battle dragged past midnight, the GIs knew that they had violated local, state, and federal laws that night, and if Cantrell was not routed before his rescuers arrived, they might spend the rest of their lives in prison. Rumors were spreading that the National Guard is on the way, or the state troopers are here, or Birch Biggs and his gang are coming. The corrupt Democrat Biggs ran Polk County even more ruthlessly than Cantrell ran McMinn County. The battle lasted about 6 hours, and at 2:30 a.m. an ambulance evacuated 2 men from the jail. The veterans assumed they were wounded deputies, but it was in fact Cantrell and Mansfield escaping the violence. Shortly afterward, ready for the fight to end, the veterans dynamited the front of the jail 4 times. After the dynamite strikes and Molotov cocktails, the jail's defenders surrendered and handed the ballot boxes over to the veterans. The townspeople set upon the captured deputies and, but for the GIs, probably would have killed them all. Minus Wilburn, a particularly unpopular deputy, had his throat slashed. Biscuit Ferris, Cantrell's prison superintendent, had his jaw shattered by a bullet, and Wendy Wise was kicked and beaten senseless. The veterans cleared the jail of the rioters and locked up their prisoners for the night. Just before dawn the next morning on August 2nd, the veterans slipped away to avoid being arrested should state or federal authorities arrive, and the New York Times reported at least 20 people were wounded in the battle. But an erroneous report was printed that the sheriff had been killed in a one-page headline, "Tennessee Sheriff is slain in primary day violence." The only death had been Gillespie, so far killed by Wise. The New York Times concluded, "Corruption, when and where it exists, demands reform, and even in the most corrupt and boss-ridden communities, there are peaceful means by which reform can be achieved, but there is no substitute in a democracy for orderly process." Many condemned the actions by the veterans. However, despite the newspapers condemning the action, the former First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt openly approved of the veterans' action, saying it was a warning against people who sought to restrict voting rights. But suddenly a power vacuum existed, so armed GIs patrolled streets in case Mansfield brought men to reclaim Athens. Hundreds of men were issued permits to carry weapons, and machine guns on rooftops guarded the approaches to town. Several times, groups of veterans rushed to barricade roads, and occasionally they terrorized innocent travelers in their attempt to thwart an invasion that never came. A search after the siege uncovered numerous blank ballots in the jail, ready to be used to hand victory to Paul Cantrell and his company. The Secretary of the Election Commission confirmed that the veterans had indeed won the election, but votes from half the precincts were thrown out because of tampering. The next day, the veterans patrolled the streets with firearms again, presumably to prevent any further violence. Because government corruption ran so deep in McMinn County, some public offices were abolished or declared vacant, and new government officials began investigations into their predecessors' actions. On August 4th, Pat Mansfield telegraphed his resignation as sheriff of McMinn County to Governor McCord and requested that Knox Henry fill his unexpired term, which would end on September 1st. Knox Henry was appointed sheriff immediately, and a count of the ballots proved he'd actually won the election anyway. And the next day, State Representative George Woods returned to the county under GI protection to convene the Election Commission and certify the election. The result of the audit proved that Knox Henry was elected sheriff over Mansfield by a vote of 2,175 to 1,270. On August 11, 1946, the 5 GIs elected to office in McMinn announced that they would return to the county all fees in excess of $5,000 and a $5,000 salary cap for officials. The corrupt local and state Democrats were being replaced. The gambling houses run by Cantrell were raided and shut down, and the deputies of the prior administration were replaced. The results of these actions saw Knox Henry serve 2 terms as sheriff of McMinn County, later succeeded by Otto Kennedy. Paul Cantrell, after seeking temporary asylum in Chattanooga, returned to Etowah and continued to operate the bank there with his brothers. Bill White was made a sheriff's deputy. Athens Mayor Paul Walker and the 4 town aldermen all resigned. Pat Mansfield returned to Athens on August 8, 1946, previously, and resigned his membership on the Election Commission. For a full year afterward, the national press seized upon the most insignificant news from Athens as evidence of the veterans' lawlessness. There was indeed remarkably little criminal prosecution following the events. The only man charged was Deputy Wendy Wise, the deputy who shot Tom Gillespie, and he received a sentence of 1 to 3 years in prison. The Battle of Athens, Tennessee, is also called the Battle of McMinn County and is now part of American political history. The event was loosely depicted in the film Battle of Athens, showing a small group of World War II veterans liberate their Tennessee town from the local sheriff and his corrupt political machine, following the stolen election of 1946, and your humble narrator suggests that film be viewed. It's quite good. Thank you for watching this episode of Forgotten History. If you liked what you saw, please click like, share, and subscribe. And if you would like to assist with the ever-increasing cost of production, please consider becoming a channel member and joining our Patreon page. Please check out our merchandise store. And thanks for watching.